This is Module 6, and this is going to deal with World War II. And because so many events happened during this period of time, which is only really 4 years for the United States, we're going to divide up this into two sections. So the one you're going to see now is Module 6A, and then it's going to be followed by Module 6B. So Module 6A is going to deal sort of with World War II from one perspective, and then Module 6B will deal with it from another perspective. Conveniently divide World War II into two parts, the rise of fascism and the fall of fascism. And so I'm going to deal primarily with the rise of fascism in this first part, and then I'm going to deal with the fall of fascism and the conclusion of the war in the second part. So last class period, or last module, we looked at 1941 and the Atlantic Charter and Pearl Harbor as the sort of major events towards the end of 1941. And then Pearl Harbor, of course, was involved in the declaration of war against Japan. And as soon as we declared war against Japan, Hitler declared war against us, which was a foregone conclusion, and we knew that the Germans were going to attack us at some point. And so people were psychologically ready for World War II. Now there's always been a certain amount of debate over still whether or not Roosevelt knew about the attack and whether it was coming and whether he kind of set things up because he really wasn't sure that the country was ready to declare war. That's one of those what-ifs or ifs conspiracy theories of history which come up periodically in the 20th century, and we'll never know the truth. But most historians agree that, including the author of your book, Herring, that that it was not a setup, and that simply was the fact that we were overconfident, which is why Japan was undefended. The attack against Pearl Harbor was immediately followed by a very spectacular expansion of the Japanese Empire into Southeast Asia. The Japanese had already begun to attack the British and French possessions, and they took over in rapid succession the Philippines, British Malaysia, French Indochina, and the Dutch colonies in Indonesia. So these four nations, Western European nations, which had had so much colonial influence in Southeast Asia, immediately fell and collapsed. And it had an enormous effect psychologically as well as politically and militarily on the rest of the world, particularly on the non-white peoples, because, you know, one of the real basis of colonialism was this inherent superiority of European civilization, and the Japanese really just showed it to be a paper tiger. 1942 really marks the high tide of fascism in the world, and as the book mentions, by the end of 1942, the Axis powers, including Japan, Germany, and Italy, controlled 1/3 of the population and the resources of the entire globe. And it looked really grim for a lot of people, and grim for the Allies. The effect of American foreign policy in World War II was multi-faceted. First of all, in terms of the State Department, the State Department really did not have that high a profile. Roosevelt controlled a lot of foreign policy directly himself. He did not, as Hitler did, interfere in the workings of his generals. He pretty much left them to their own devices. But he definitely did intervene in the State Department, where there was a really personality feud going on between Cordell Hull and Sumner Welles, which really debilitated the department a great deal. So Roosevelt brought in other people, such as Adolf Burl, and a number of other people. Henry Stimson, who had been the Secretary of State in the 30s. Another person who had a very powerful influence on foreign policy at this time was Henry Wallace, the Vice President, who was definitely a liberal internationalist and whom, as we shall see, came to play a very controversial role in the post-war period. Just as there had been a creation of alphabet agencies during the New Deal, there was also a creation of alphabet agencies during World War II, the two most important of which were the OWI, the Office of War Information, and by far the most important was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was basically our intelligence service, which later became the CIA. And the director of the OSS was William Donovan, later known as Wild Bill Donovan. And so the whole American intelligence establishment really got its start with the OSS during World War II. World War II also thrust the military into a leadership role more than it ever had been before. There had always been a certain amount of tension between the presidents and the military. There was during the Civil War between President Lincoln and George McClellan. But this time, the Roosevelt relied very heavily on his generals. And the increased influence of the military in foreign policy was symbolized by the construction of the Pentagon. Just briefly about the alliances. We've already seen that the first wartime alliance was the Atlantic Charter, the meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill in August of 1941, just before we got into the war. There were three other major wartime conferences. Actually 4 other major wartime conferences. Casablanca in 1943, Tehran in 1944, and then 2 conferences in 1945, Yalta and Potsdam. And just remember that at the Casablanca conference was Roosevelt and Churchill, and some of the Free French leaders were present, but not Stalin. At the Tehran conference, for the first time, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin got together, the big three. And then in 1945, the 2 major conferences. Most important was Yalta, extremely controversial conference, very important. And then following, at Yalta, there was Churchill, Roosevelt, who was a very sick man by this time, and Stalin. And then finally in July and early August of 1945, there was Potsdam, where Roosevelt had been replaced by Truman, and Roosevelt had died, and Churchill was replaced by Clement Attlee because Roosevelt had lost the election. So the Soviets had kind of an advantage by having this one leader who had been at all of these major wartime conferences, and they really were very well informed. But the British and Americans stuck together, and we'll see how controversial. Now, basically, the Americans and the Brits were very close to each other and tended to be very suspicious of Stalin. Essentially, Stalin believed that the British and Americans were ganging up on him and stabbing him in the back. There were a lot of different points of view among the Allies, especially in the Roosevelt administration. You had people like Henry Wallace, who believed that we could live with the Russians, that they didn't want to live under communism, but we could coexist. And then there were a lot of people who basically sympathized with Churchill and the Brits, who felt that the Soviets were our enemies and we could never live with them after the war, and we'd have to eventually fight them just as we'd fought Hitler. So there was, on the one hand, this division among the Allies between the sort of liberal leftists who kind of were soft on Stalin and the hardliners who were more closer to Churchill, who wanted to take a hard anti-communist line. And Stalin, again, felt that the Brits and the Americans, especially the Brits, were capable of making deals with Hitler and double-crossing him. So he was always afraid of a double cross, especially from the British. Grand strategy for the Allies was to basically attack on the Eastern Front and build up Russia, and attack on the Southern Front through the Mediterranean, to which Churchill referred to Italy as the soft underbelly of fascism. And once Italy was liberated, then to turn and invade Western Europe. Stalin didn't like that. He wanted the Americans to open up a second front as soon as possible, and he felt that the invasion of North Africa and the occupation of Egypt and the Suez Canal was to save the British Empire. And he wanted to see the Allies invade Western Europe, because to his mind, it was the Soviets who had really borne the human burden of the war. Another major of Franklin Roosevelt's agenda was a world body. He saw himself as a descendant of Woodrow Wilson ideologically, and so he was determined that whereas Wilson had failed to get us to join the League of Nations, that he wanted the United States to play a central role in the new United Nations organization. The term United Nations originally referred to the major countries that were fighting the fascists. In addition to the big three, there were a number of other allies in Europe, in Latin America, and around the world who had joined the Allies. So those were the United Nations, the anti-Axis powers. Now there were two major battles in 1942 which really sort of turned the tide. In the Pacific was the Battle of Midway, which was a naval battle in which the United States Navy, which although largely destroyed at Pearl Harbor, had made an amazing comeback, which was a testimony to America's enormous power of productivity and organization once we got started and decided that we wanted to do something. And so all the vessels that had been destroyed at Pearl Harbor were not only replaced, but our Navy was expanded. And with overwhelming naval superiority, we were able to basically knock out the Japanese Navy. And so the Battle of Midway really turned the tide. It was a naval battle that turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. However, the Japanese still held on to a lot of islands in the South Pacific, and they were dug in, and the only way to get them out was a land war, which of course proved to be extraordinarily bloody and brutal and costly in human life. More costly in terms of human life was on the eastern front of Russia, and between the Red Army and the Wehrmacht. It was just horrific. It lasted from 1942 through 1943. It was a long, drawn-out war, but by the winter of 1943, the German army had largely been destroyed and captured. The winter of Russia was one of the major factors, but just the tenacity of the Russians. And of course, a lot of historians believe that the Russians were fighting for the motherland, for Russia, for Russian nationalism as much as for communism. So by the end of 1943, Operation Torch, which had been the Allied invasion of North Africa, and resulted in the Italian campaign, a slow, hard, heavy-fought movement up the Italian peninsula. Rome was liberated in 1944, but the fascists held on. Mussolini surrendered, and his place was taken by the fascist leader Marshal Badoglio, who had actually signed a peace treaty with the Allies, but then he did step down. Mussolini was basically murdered, and his body dragged through the streets. The Italians really turned on him. But Marshal Badoglio, the fascist leader, did assume temporary power in Italy, which fed, of course, Stalin's fears. Just as the Battle of Stalingrad and the Winter War in Russia was the turning point in the war in the East, the turning point in the war in the West came in June of 1944 with the Allied invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord. Again, a very bloody invasion, but in terms of human life, still nowhere near equal in terms of loss of soldiers, the war on the Eastern Front. But gradually, the Allies pushed the Germans back, and in August of 1944, Paris was liberated by a combination of Allied soldiers, French soldiers that included a large number of Algerians and North Africans, which also, as we shall see later, played an important role in the whole anti-colonial movement. And so by the winter of 1945, the Germans had been pushed back beyond the Rhine into the Ardennes Forest, to the Ardennes Forest, which was near the Rhine in northern France. Briefly a bit about Latin America. The Roosevelt administration, you recall, had formulated the Good Neighbor policy in Latin America, which was to try to increase American good feelings towards the Latin Americans. The United States put a great deal of emphasis on getting the Latin American countries to support us, but there was and the book doesn't really talk enough about this. There was a great deal of fascist sentiment in Latin America. In Mexico, there was a strong fascist movement called the Sinarquistas that was founded in 1938. They never captured national politics, but they had a lot of influence, not only in Mexico, but throughout Latin America. They were extremely anti-communist, anti-liberal, put a great deal of emphasis on religion, and the Sinarquista movement had copy movements in many parts of Latin America, especially in Chile and Argentina, where there were large immigrant populations from Italy and from Germany. The United States put a lot of emphasis on opposing fascism in Latin America. But Latin Americans were still a little bit suspicious of the Yankees because the United States was willing to support a lot of dictatorial governments as long as they said they were friendly to the United States. So there were a lot of sort of fascistic leaders who, as long as they professed loyalty to the USA, were allowed to repress their own people.